Primitive Village, Volume 5, Chapter 3. Page 232, number 3. A villager dies in this section. Number 4, Uncle writes the letter to Ding Xiaoming to start the proceedings of giving him his property and marry his ex-wife. And then in number 5, Uncle gives up his property and they agreed to get divorced so that Uncle and Ling Ling can get married. Chapter 4, page 235, number 1. Uncle and Ling Ling got married. They had made it official. They were husband and wife. Now, finally, they could move into Uncle's house. On the day of the move, they borrowed a cart, and in 2 trips managed to move everything from the threshing ground back to the village. By the time they arrived at Uncle's house, Ling Ling was perspiring heavily. But there was still work to be done. There were quilts and kitchenware and furniture and boxes to be unloaded and arranged in the house. By the time they had put everything in order, Ling Ling was drenched in sweat. She ripped off some of her clothes and went outside to take the air. Her sweating subsided, but by evening she began to feel parched and feverish again, as if her whole body were burning up. Thinking she was coming down with a cold, Ling Ling took some medicine and a draught of ginger tea, but neither brought down her fever. A fortnight later, she realized what was happening. It wasn't a fever, but the fever. Her disease was full-blown. She was dying. She hadn't a bit of strength left in her body. She didn't have the energy to eat or even to lift up a bowl. One day, Uncle made her some ginger tea to help bring down her fever, but when he raised the bowl to her lips, she refused to drink it. She stared in alarm at his gaunt face and the several new spots that had appeared on his forehead. "When did you get those spots on your face?" she asked. "Don't worry, I'm fine. Take off your clothes." "I'm fine," said Uncle, with his usual careless grin. "If that's true," Ling Ling raised her voice, "then take off your clothes and show me." As Uncle removed his shirt and loosened his trousers, Ling Ling saw the angry rash of red bumps that stretched around his midriff. The blisters were fierce and shiny, as if they were bursting with blood. Uncle had stopped wearing his leather belt because it chafed the rash, and had instead replaced it with a long cloth sash threaded through the belt loops of his trousers. Ling Ling hadn't noticed the sash before, because Uncle had always been careful to cover it with his shirt. Now, with the ends of the sash dangling from his waist, Uncle looked like one of those old-time peasant farmers who tied their trousers with whatever bit of cloth they could find. As she gazed at the rash on Uncle's waist, Ling Ling's eyes filled with tears. Then, despite her tears, she began to laugh. "It's probably better this way," she said, chuckling, "that both of our fevers have flared up at the same time. Just a few days ago, I was worried that I'd die first, and you'd end up getting back together with Ting Ting." Uncle, too, began to laugh. "I was afraid to tell you, but my fever flared up first. The day I stopped wearing my belt, I thought, oh God, please let Ling Ling's fever get worse, too. Don't let me drop dead and leave her here well and alive." Uncle smiled, a wicked smile. Ling Ling reached out and gave him a little pinch. "I haven't touched you in weeks," said Uncle, setting the bowl of ginger tea on the bedside table. "It's been weeks since we did anything in bed. Didn't you notice and think my fever was getting worse?" Ling Ling shook her head and smiled. After that, they had a lot to talk about. "Well, isn't this great?" said Ling Ling. "The minute we move into the house, we both get sick." "If we have to die soon, at least we'll die together. I hope I'm the first to go, so you can give me a nice funeral. But you have to promise to buy me some decent clothes. I don't want to be buried in one of those horrible black funeral outfits. I want a dress. No, 2 dresses, one bright red. Ever since I was small, I've loved bright red. As for the other one, something plain, a lighter color. That way I'll have a change of clothes in the afterlife. And I'll buy you a pair of red high heels, the sexy kind, like the ones city girls wear." For a long time, Ling Ling was silent. She scrutinized Uncle's face, as if she were unsure about something. "Forget it. It's better if you die first. Otherwise I'd worry too much," said Ling Ling. "But I'd give you a great funeral. I've got my dad and brother to take care of mine. But if I'm not around when you die, who's going to make sure you get a proper burial?" "You say that now," said Ting Ting with tears in her eyes, "but I'd still worry about you." "What, don't you trust me?" "That's not what I meant." After a few more complaints about what Uncle might do if left to his own devices, Ling Ling said, I think it's best if we die together. No, let's not. If I die first, you should be free to enjoy the time you have left. And if you die first, I should be able to do the same. You're not thinking about me, you're thinking about yourself, Ling Ling pouted. What you really mean is that you should be free to enjoy the time you have left. That's not what I meant. That's exactly what you meant. They continued to argue like two children playing at being angry. One's uncle turned around and accidentally knocked the bowl of ginger tea from the bedside table. It fell to the floor with a crack and shattered into pieces. The fighting stopped. Ling Ling and Uncle stared at the broken bowl. Both knew that breaking a bowl of medicine was a bad omen. It meant that a person was going to die soon, so taking medicine was pointless. They stared at each other in silence. The room grew still, the atmosphere oppressive. They could feel themselves beginning to sweat, like buns in a bamboo steamer, or peas boiling in a pot. Both of them had grown thin, so very gaunt and thin. Ling Ling's once voluptuous bosom seemed to have collapsed. The breasts that Uncle had adored now hung from her chest like two sacks of withered flesh. Her moist and rosy skin, which had maintained its glow despite the many rashes and spots, had turned ashen, marred with discoloration like patches of rust. Her eyes were sunken, the hollows as large as hen's eggs. Her cheekbones jutted out like the poles of a funeral tent. Her person was so shrunken, so diminished, that she seemed hardly a person at all. Her dry, dull hair, which hadn't been combed in days, lay on her pillowcase like a tangle of rust, a clump of wormwood that sprouted from her pillow. As for Uncle, he still managed to put away as much food as ever, but Lord only knows where it went. His square face had become hatchet-like, his cheekbones sharp as knife blades. His eyes held none of their former light, the pupils had shrunken, leaving too much white. After breaking the bowl, he stared for a long time at the ceramic shards that littered the floor. Ling Ling, when I said I wanted you to die first, I wasn't being selfish. I was only thinking of what's best for you. If you don't believe me, I'll kill myself right now. Kill yourself how? I'll hang myself. Go ahead then. Ling Ling sat up in bed and ran her fingers through her tangled hair. Her expression was calm and composed. We're both going to die soon anyway. Go get some rope. When I see you stand on a stool and put your head in the noose, I'll put my head in another noose, and we'll both kick the stools away at the same time. If we can't live together, at least we can die together. Uncle stared at Ling Ling, unsure if she was serious. Go get some rope, she repeated. Uncle didn't move. Go on. I think there's some under the bed. Backed into a corner, Uncle stared at Ling Ling for a long time before he bent down and began rummaging under the bed. He found the rope, fashioned two nooses, stood on a bench, and hung them from the rafter above. When he had finished this task, he turned to look at Ling Ling. It was as if he were sizing her up, testing to see who was more courageous. It was a tender look, a teasing challenge. Uncle was surprised to find that Ling Ling, so gentle in life, so wild in bed, would be so steadfast in the face of death. After Uncle had secured the nooses, Ling Ling stood up calmly, washed her face, ran a comb through her hair, and went out to lock the courtyard gate. When she returned, she stepped up onto the wooden stool and looked at Uncle. If we die together, she declared, it'll prove that our love was not in vain, that we have no regrets. It was barely noon, and the sun hung in the eastern sky, its fiery rays streaming through the window and onto the bed. The quilt was neatly folded, the clothes in their cupboards, and the chairs and tables lined up against the walls. Everything they had moved from the threshing ground had been unpacked, and the room was in perfect order. Ling Ling had even laundered the curtain that hung from the door, washing it until it was sparkling clean. She had made this house her own, washing and scrubbing until every last trace of Song Ting Ting was gone. It was her house now. She had even removed Ting Ting's mattress and replaced it with one that she and Uncle had slept on. Time and again she had wiped down the boxes and trunks that Ting Ting had used to rid them of the other woman's smell. She had collected the bowls that Ting Ting had eaten from and taken them out to the coop to use for chicken feed. This was her and Uncle's home now, and Ling Ling would die happier knowing that her house was in perfect order. She had even taken the shovels and hoes from behind the doors and stored them beneath the eaves of the courtyard. Ling Ling glanced around the four corners of the room and saw that everything was neat and tidy, 4 square walls of a tomb. There was nothing left to unpack, nothing to tidy up, nothing left to do but die. Satisfied that the room was perfect, Ling Ling picked up a damp towel from the washstand and wiped her face. Then she stepped calmly onto the stool that Uncle had prepared for her, grasped the noose dangling from the rafters, and turned to look at him. At this point, there was no retreat, no moving forward, and no turning back. The only choice was to stick one's neck into the noose. Uncle took the circle of rope in both hands. Ling Ling did the same. She stared hard at Uncle, her gaze compelling him to put his head into the noose so that she could follow suit. They were boxed into a corner now, at a dead end, and the only thing left to do was die. But at that moment, Uncle broke into a grin, a wicked devil-may-care sort of grin, and said, "Still, I'll take every day I can. If you want to die, you go ahead, but I want to go on living." With this, Uncle stepped off the stool, sat down on the bed, and looked up at his wife, still clutching the noose in her hands. "Ling Ling, come down from there. If you do, I promise to be your servant and wait on you hand and foot." Uncle stood up, took Ling Ling in his arms, and lifted her down from the stool, then laid her gently on the bed and began removing her clothes. He gazed at her nude body, at the skin that had once been so fair, but was now as dry and dull as withered grass after a long winter. Her face was pitiful to look at, wretched and gaunt, streaked with resentful tears. "Let's do it," she begged. "Let's just hang ourselves." "No, let's not. Each day we're alive is better than being dead. And just think about how much we have to live for. We've got food to eat, a place to live, and we've got each other. If you're hungry, we can fry up some cakes in the kitchen. If we're thirsty, we can drink sugar water. And if we get lonely, we can go out into the street and talk to people. I want you so much, Ling Ling. I want to stroke your face and kiss your lips. The only thing I worry about is not being able to make love to you." But that is exactly what Uncle did, summon all of his strength and make love to his wife. Uncle always was a rascal. Afterwards, Ling Ling thought of something. "Liang, we didn't even apply in person. Do you think your brother will come through with our official marriage license?" "Don't worry about it," Uncle answered smugly. "I hear they're promoting him to the head of the county AIDS task force. Getting a marriage license should be a piece of cake."